好，大家好，我们这一期的直播呢，给大家直播这个一起来看一看，我也是第一次看啊，是第一次看。就这两天呢，这个伯恩斯很出名啊，伯恩斯9月15号的时候有一个访谈，9月17号上传的，应该是可能9月15号做的访谈，还是反正最近吧，做了一个访谈。说了几个金句是吧？我见过解放军，他们真的很强啊！我见过解放军。好，我们来看一下，我也第一次看，一起来看一下他的这个访谈，然后我们可以这个一起看一下啊。好。
The Trump tariffs have completely made this a Wild West.Globally, the world
Wild West 应该是这个狂野西部，它应该是一种引申的意思啊，就是混乱了，是吧？
Eisenhower and JFK and Reagan created on tariffs, on the United Nations system, on a great power peace is gone. And I think, unfortunately, we are now entering a world of disorder, and the tariffs problem right now is a very good example of that.
Hello, World Boston. This is fantastic, and I know people are still coming in. What an exciting turnout of our community we have here, and also I know a lot of people are on Zoom, so what a terrific pleasure to see you all here. I'm just going to give you snippets of our speakers' impressive.
这个他主持人要介绍一下伯恩斯是前驻华大使啊，可能很多人都知道这么个人啊。我在直播的时候可能偶尔要点一下，要解说一下啊，可能有点烦，但是这个可能会避免一些 copyright 的问题啊。
Impressive bio, but please read it in full because it is uplifting and impressive. So Ambassador Nicholas Burns returned to Harvard in spring of 2025 as the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of
Professor， 他是个哈佛大学的教授啊。
Diplomacy and International Politics at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also faculty chair of the Future of Diplomacy Project and faculty member at Harvard's Fairbanks Center on China. All right, I'm going to edit because
费正清这个研究中心啊，这个很有名啊。
Time is ticking. He's also co-chair of the Aspen Strategy and Aspen Security Forum and vice chair of the Cohen Group.Longtime member of the Council on Foreign Relations, Massachusetts, for over 3 decades.
这个大家都知道，算了。
6 lives a professor at the Kennedy School, and John Kerry, Dean, honorary degrees, and many awards, including
15个荣誉学位，太牛了，算是个牛人呢，学霸。
What an honor to welcome Nicholas Burns back to World Boston.
这个在波士顿，好。
Mary, thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day to this extraordinary location. I've always loved the Boston Public Library. I love what it's the words etched into the granite, built by the people and dedicated to the advancement of learning. My wife Libby's here. She and I stood outside. We arrived a little bit early and just marveled at the architecture here of Copley Square, not at all of Copley Square, but certainly of this building. And I'm really honored to be here as someone who grew up in Wellesley, went to Boston College. It's nice to be home. I want to say a word about World Boston. We are a global city. Since 1630, we've been looking out on the world, on the Atlantic seaboard, the health of our economy. The whole purpose of this city is to be outward looking.And that certainly was true in 1630. It was true in 1930 on the 300th anniversary.
Outward looking， 之前是 outward looking， 肯定后面会说现在的问题啊。
Of the city, but today.
But today， 看到没？就开始欲扬先抑啊。老美的很多的这个有言论自由，确实他这个敢讲啊，开始批了。我们看一下怎么批。 批当前的这个政治啊。
If we think about what the economy of our Commonwealth is based on, the life sciences and medicine and healthcare, and our
确实，美国的这个医药、生命科学这块确实非常先进啊。中国在医药这块这几年有一定的趋势，往这儿赶，但是还差得比较远。
Extraordinary collection of universities, we have to be outward looking. And World Boston is the principal organization in this.
对，波士顿它应该是哈佛大学、MIT， 哈佛大学和 MIT 都在那边，很多的研究机构啊。
That asks us to look out at the rest of the world to understand it and the complexity and challenges and opportunities that we have. And Mary has done great work as its president. Will Lowell is here. He's chair of the board. There are a lot of board members, and I just ask you, thank them for what they're doing for our city. So Mary and I are going to have a conversation about a light, carefree, easy subject. The U.S. relationship with China. Libby and I have just returned in January from
这个谈到重点了，该讲中国了，哎。
living in Beijing. It was an extraordinary experience, and we'll talk about that. We also want to talk about the other challenges facing the United States. Putin's tragic, cynical, brutal invasion of Ukraine. His attempt to exterminate the Ukrainian state and divide Europe again. The chaotic nature of a changing balance of power in the Middle East, where, fortunately, Israel is at its strongest position since the day it was created, May 14th, 1948. That's good news. And Iran is in its weakest position since the Iranian Revolution of 1978 and 79. That's also good news. But 3 wars still brewing, and a tremendous, tragic, sorrowful humanitarian conflict in the Palestinian territories for the Palestinian people in Gaza and the West Bank. We should talk about that tonight as well.
这个以色列和在中东的这个冲突啊，确实现在在美国是一个非常激烈的争论的焦点啊，一个焦点之一啊。
But it's also
连很多美国的大学生去年的时候，他们就游行，很多大学游行抗议，但是今年那个时候还是这个民主党执政，今年呢共和党上台了啊，大家都不敢了啊，不敢了。
Also, in a way, it's an auspicious day, and it's also a very sad day for America. And so Mary and I thought I should say a word about what happened yesterday. And that's the assassination of Charlie Kirk. I did not know him, but he was an
他也讲到了这个查理·科克的案件啊，被刺杀的案件。
American exercising his First Amendment rights, exercising his responsibilities as a citizen as he saw those responsibilities to speak out in our society. And he was killed for it. And the only
这个也是非常 crazy 啊，在美国现在大家都在谈这个事儿，影响应该很大。很多人认为可能未来10年民主党都没法继续执政了，有可能是共和党下一届还会赢。
possible response that any of us can have as Americans is to denounce that murder and that assassination. And I was so hard.
确实搞这种暗杀确实要谴责啊！这个不管是别人说了什么啊，别人有权利去，就是你，悲剧，总之是悲剧，反正得谴责这种暗杀行为啊。
Heartened to see that all of our former living presidents all spoke out in deeply passionate terms. George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and they urged us to rely, as Lincoln urged us in our greatest conflict, on the better angels of our nature, and to see past
在冲突的时候要用人性中善良的这一面
the red-blue divisions in this society and to unite as Americans. Political violence against the right, or political violence against Melissa Hortman, a state senator from Minnesota killed with her husband at her front door.
右翼的被右翼的政治暴力杀害，就是说左翼和右翼的其实都会搞这个暴力。
3 months ago, she was part of our community. She was a graduate of Harvard Kennedy School, where I am now teaching. And so whether it's violence against a conservative figure or a progressive figure or a centrist or anybody, it's inadmissible. It's unworthy of a great nation. And I hope that we can proceed in that basis. I was thinking this morning about April 4th, 1968. I was 12. I was at Perrin's School, a sixth grader in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And I had an enlightened teacher, Mrs. Barton, who urged us to understand the life of Martin Luther King and the need at that time to close another divide between African Americans and white Americans. And so I remember that Robert Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, had gone into a black neighborhood in Indianapolis that night because the fear was that America was going to be lit on fire by the assassination of someone who I think is the greatest American of the last half century, and more than that.
就是一个白人进到黑人社区里面，这个黑人他们的领袖马丁路德金被枪杀了，他觉得可能要陷入内战了。这个人叫 Robert 肯尼迪。
That's Martin Luther King. Here's what Senator Kennedy said that night, which I think has resonance for us today. He said, "It's not the end of the violence. It's not the end of lawlessness. And it is not the end of disorder. Let us dedicate ourselves to what the Greeks wrote so many years ago, to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of this world." And he said, let us dedicate ourselves to that and say a prayer for our country and say a prayer for our people. Fitting words from 1968 that might help us both understand what's happened to our country and what we need to do to unite it. Mary and I were talking backstage about what this means for us as a global power. We, I think, cannot be successful as a model for the democratic world if we do not put some of the violence, all of the violence, and the red-blue divide.
有道理，这个很有道理啊。这很多美国人、很多中国人提起美国啊，就是你这个搞暴力是吧？政治暴力，这个美利坚很危险是吧？那你这个那咋可能成为民主世界的典范呢？对吧？还是我之前有分享过一个视频，但是后来我把那个视频给下架了。那个视频说是有一点，因为用那个时候不太懂啊，可能有点侵权的嫌疑啊，所以我就把它下架了。但那个呢，就是牛津大学的剑桥大学的一个教授是吧？他们在剑桥有一个 debate， 教授得出结论说啊，中国逐渐的发现西方没什么值得学习的。那你把中国人人手一把枪，那中国我不知道，也有可能变成像美国这个样子，不知道。但是对于中国人来讲的话，可能是无法想象的。
Behind us. And so we'll talk about that as well tonight. Finally, there's another auspicious part of today. It was a beautiful day today, and reminiscent of what started off as a beautiful sunny day on September 11th, 2001. And all of us who are Bostonians remember that 2 of the planes involved in the attack by Al-Qaeda took off from Logan Airport. I was not here. I was American ambassador to NATO in Brussels, Belgium.
这是讲911事件是吧？
We were 6 hours ahead of the East Coast, and when we heard about the attacks, my team and I of military and officers and diplomats gathered together and we tried to call the White House, and the White House had been evacuated because there was a fear of an attack on Washington. Of course, the Pentagon had been attacked. The State Department had been evacuated. The Defense Department had been evacuated. And we didn't know if the attack would hit American military installations around the world. And so I couldn't reach anyone. But my phone rang. And it was a guy named David Wright, who was the Canadian ambassador to NATO. And David said, "Nick, have you thought about invoking Article 5 of the NATO treaty in response to what al-Qaeda, he knew and I knew it was al-Qaeda, have done. Now, Article 5 of our treaty from 1949 basically says if one of us is attacked, it shall be considered that all of us are attacked. That was written and agreed to by President Harry Truman because he feared, and Europe feared in April 1949, that Stalin would attack Western Europe and we'd be involved in a third world war. And the Allies, when they formed NATO, wanted to be assured that Canada and the United States would come a third time in the 20th century to defend Europe. What a huge irony it was for me and my team that day, that actually Europe and Canada came to our rescue that day. And what's very meaningful about it is that when all the NATO nations had decided they would invoke Article 5, the next morning, September 12th, I figured I needed presidential guidance and instruction because we knew this meant that we'd have to go into Afghanistan in a war. And so I called my closest friend at that point in the White House, Condoleezza Rice. I had worked for her before. She was the National Security Advisor. It was 4 a.m. I said, Condi, the Allies want to invoke Article 5. She said, go for it. I said, thank you, Condi, for your sentiment. I think I need the president's personal instruction to vote for Article 5. She said, go for it. And I tried a third time. I said, Condi. She said, Nick, he's had a really bad day. He's trying to get some sleep. Go for it. I said, I'll take that, Condi, you're the National Security Advisor, as my presidential instruction. And I'm going to head down to our central room and I'm going to vote on behalf of the United States. We're going to go to war with al-Qaeda. She said one more thing. And I've always remembered what she said. She said, it's good to have friends in the world. And boy, have I thought about
是吧？美国人家有这个 alliance 是吧？美国 alliance 他们的盟友啊，美国的盟友世界上很多呀。所以这个美国遭受911攻击的时候，人家其他的国家这个会支援他。也是上一期视频里面那个军事博主他们认为，中国的这个航空母舰没什么用啊，为啥？因为中国没有盟友，在世界很多地方没有港口，是吧？人家说的也是事实，是吧？这也是美国的一个优势啊，盟友多，这个小兄弟也多。
that many times over the course of the years.
但是美国人讲话喜欢欲意先扬啊。他现在说美国有很多盟友，肯定是想后面说现在怎么样，完蛋了。我这是我的预测啊，这是我第一次看啊，我预测。
But particularly this year, I thought about it when people in the administration began to attack the sovereignty of Canada. It was Canada who decided to lead the parade to assist the United States. It was Denmark also attacked the sovereignty of Denmark right behind them. And I think the biggest takeaway of my entire career, dating back to 1980 as a diplomat, but certainly the time when Libby and I were living in China, is we're a powerful country. Thank goodness for that. Our military power, our diplomatic power, our technology power of the 21st century. But if we are to create
看一下，这哥们儿当时在中国生活吗？追溯到1980年担任外交官的时候，当然。
But certainly the time when Libby and I were living in China is we're a power.
他应该是1980年代的时候也在中国担任外交官。
Powerful country. Thank goodness for that. Our military power, our diplomatic power, our technology power of the 21st century. But if we are to create, as Robert Kennedy said, a better world, a more peaceful world, a world where democracy can thrive, we need friends in the world. You saw that parade last week in Beijing on September 3rd. You saw that axis of authoritarian leaders, Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, the president of Iran. They don't want a democratic world. They don't want a world where women
这个是提到韭菜阅兵了，看来把这些人吓够呛啊。
rights are respected, or civil freedoms and press freedoms are respected. But we want that world. And
民主的世界，他们想要一个民主的世界，这也是美国这是美国的优势啊，美国肯定不能丢掉这个民主啊，这个民主对美国来讲那是他最重要的优势了。
And so the takeaway here for our discussion tonight, particularly when we talk about our extraordinarily competitive relationship with China, is when we have Japan and Korea and the Philippines and Australia, all treaty allies, working with us. When we have India, our great strategic partner.
印度，有的人说印度不是盟友啊，有的像这个米尔斯海默啊，说印度不是一个美国的盟友。
Working with us, when we have NATO working with us, we outweigh and can out-leverage Putin and Xi Jinping. But if we're not good to our allies, if we're not respect
对盟友，如果对盟友不好，不尊重盟友，这是意思就很明显。现在开始，这个英文讲英文世界里面都是这样啊，这个正反都要说，是吧？要欲以扬先抑，欲以先扬，那都是有讲究的啊。看你的重点是什么。
Respectful of our allies, we lose, and we're less affected. I can't think of a more important message for the American people and for all of us as citizens as we continue to think about America's role in the world. Thank you very much.
演讲10分钟，15分钟结束，开始访谈了。
Thank you so much, Nick. Thank you again for being with us. What we thought which makes sense is to sort of start with China, and then we'll go to the rest of the world. As ambassador, you were the president's personal representative in China, managing, optimizing the most important bilateral relationship in the world right now.
Not for the faint of heart.
Not for the faint of heart. You have many times talked about how this is not exactly we're not in a Cold War. It's not exactly a rivalry. It's a competition. So I'm wondering if you could tell us what you mean by that and what arenas the competition is taking place in.
Thank you. So Libby and I were living in China, representing our country. And I think there's no question that as we
这老外，这个 Libby 应该是他老婆。
look out on the world, we've got lots of challenges. I mentioned some of them. But China is the strongest adversary we have in the world.
中国是最强对手，有那么强吗？
We're the two largest economies, and we have almost irreconcilable differences between us on trade and on tariffs. We're the two strongest militaries. We're the only two countries, I hope this doesn't sound arrogant to any non-American here, but I think we're the only two countries with true global reach we can affect because of the economic power, the cultural power of both China and the United States have an impact on the rest of the world.
这中国，说实话，我同意他这个观点啊，同意他这个中国的文化的影响啊。回头我跟大家一起欣赏一下子。有一群老外在看这个中国的动作电影啊，中国的动作电影在美国其实很有影响力啊，就是中国的功夫电影啊，文化影响力啊，中国的文化影响力那是真的文化。那你好莱坞的文化那是啥文化？那是一种怎么说呢？那可以说是一种宣传，是吧？或者是说一种就是它因为它比较现代化嘛，都是一些外星科技啊，它是单个的故事，可能整体来看的话，传递一种美式的价值观。但是中国的那个文化是几千年积淀的，比如说京剧啊，是吧？武术啊，是吧？扯远了，我们接着看啊，接着看。
I think we're structural rivals, no matter who's in the White House, and I think no matter probably who's in Zhongnanhai, which is
大家知道中南海
where the Chinese leadership lives near the Forbidden City in Beijing. This rivalry is going to continue into the 2030s and the 2040s. There's an established power.
这个我觉得这个话就是说，对于所有的华人，也是中国人的话，也是应该怎么说呢？也是有意义的。就是说，中美的竞争啊，你这个东西是没办法的事儿。就它两个强大的国家在一块儿，一山不容二虎，这是人类的，这是人的劣根性啊！这不是中国的问题，也不是美国的问题，这就是人的劣根性。人就要分出一个高下啊！尤其是两个强者在一起的时候，啊，资源确实是有限的，除非未来很快这个AI 人工智能解决了全人类的这个饮食啊各方面的科技这个生存的这个医药啊，对吧？生死问题全部解决，那可能中国和美国没有冲突了，只能依靠这一点，就是能够给人类提供无穷无尽的这个能源，是吧？那你不用争了嘛，你不用竞争了，没有生存竞争，是吧？那就不用适者生存，就不用互相斗了嘛，没有阶级斗争了嘛，对吧？没办法啊，所以说中美的竞争啊，那你只能作为一个老百姓，只能就是看戏啊，看看，对吧？你可能几十年前的中国人，你也看到中国跟美国在打，现在中国和美国还是在竞争啊，竞争。
Since 1945, the United States, there's a rising power with a completely different, and here's one of the big differences, value system. We believe in human freedom. We're not perfect, but we believe in democracy and the rule of the people. The Communist Party of China believes in the rule of the Communist Party of China. It is an extraordinarily repressive authoritarian regime. It's more repressive now than it was the day Xi Jinping came to power.In 2012, and so the biggest difference is that difference over how we want.
这个中国人肯定不同意他这个观点，对不对？大陆的这可能很多清华的，包括马侃硕啊，很多这个杨护法是吧？国师啊，杨国师都不同意他这个看法啊。就不同的人可能有不同的看法。我这个频道呢，并不完全支持某一种看法。我们只是看一看，知道别人怎么想的就行了，这是我个人看法。
People to be treated and the rights that people have in our society. That's one difference. Second difference, we are with our allies, particularly the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians, and the Indians. If you think about the Indo-Pacific, I wish I had brought a map, from the Persian Gulf,all the way across the Arabian Sea, the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, the Western Pacific, and the Pacific Ocean states, island states, we are by far, the United States Navy and Air Force, the supreme power. China's trying to knock us off as the number one military power. The rise of the PLA, the biggest buildup of military power in the world in the last 20 years has been the People's Liberation Army.Biggest buildup of nuclear weapons in the world is the People's Liberation Army. Their design and aim is to make us the number 2 military power in 10 to 15 years' time and make themselves the largest power. That will change the Pacific and Asia forever in a bad way if it happens. That's a second arena of competition. A third is technology. And, I think it's moved to center stage because of this transformative technology.Artificial intelligence，
这就是悲剧所在啊！这个悲剧就在于，不管中国怎么样说啊，不寻求霸权，但是当你强大到一定的程度了之后，可能别人就会把你视作一个对手啊，你说什么都没有用啊。
Intelligence, there is an extraordinary competition between the American tech companies.And the Chinese tech companies, Baidu, Tencent, Alibaba, I visited all of them, know their leadership, and they want to be first mover and first adapter of both artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence. And, this is a very different battle than the old Cold War. If you think about the nuclear weapons competition, think of Eisenhower and Kennedy and Reagan. Those were technologies controlled by governments, produced by governments.And this is a very different competition governments don't have real competence in AI, but our tech companies do. So it's the American tech companies versus the Chinese tech companies. Americans assisted by the Japanese and the Germans and the British, our allies. And whoever wins the battle to be dominant in that technology as an originator and adapter is going to be the supreme economic power for the next 30 or 40 years. We've got to win. And President Trump has taken the position to very lightly regulate our AI sector right now because he wants us to win. I think Trump's right about that, by the way. So that's another big battle. And finally, is trade and tariffs. Now, I didn't support 145% tariffs, and China responded with 125.
125，中国是125的比例啊。它这个翻译应该，我看它这个翻译80%-90%应该都是，甚至95%以上都是对的啊。但是有的地方还是有一些小问题，但我觉得不影响理解。所以，如果没有特别严重的地方，我也不会，就是说不会说打断啊，去提醒一下我们，多看一点，我觉得比斤斤计较某一些小的这个错误，我觉得要好一点。我们接着看吧。
But frankly, China hasn't played by the rules. I spoke to nearly
hasn't played by the rules， 就是他们中国没有按照规矩来。
Every American CEO came to China. I spent a lot of time with the business community. Intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, the market access, the lack of a level playing field for American business, and we have thousands of businesses. In a $642 billion two-way trade relationship, our firms are lucky to be profitable. So President Trump's very aggressive.
还 lucky， 那中国的市场那么大是吧？站在中国的角度来想的话，中国会觉得你来这儿挣钱，你不能你就把钱挣走了，然后完了你中国一点好处没捞着啊，对不对？中国人就是讲究这个占点便宜啊，占点便宜，对不对？就我觉得可能是文化上的差异，有一些文化，而且强制的技术转移，我不知道是不是违反 WTO 的协议啊？我不知道啊，大家可以留言啊。
Aggressive tariffs against China, I actually think are appropriate in this instance, and they've gotten the attention of Xi Jinping. I also think there's probably going to be a trade deal. Probably in the next 2 months, that's going to be a good thing for China and the United States. The mistake, I think, and I'll finish on this, Mary, is by President Trump, is that I thought it was appropriate to go after the Chinese, but he simultaneously put high tariffs on all of our allies, on Japan, on South Korea, 50% tariffs on India, maybe the most important military strategic partner that we have in the Pacific, and of course going after Canada.
印度是美国最重要的盟友，这个人也是个脑袋也有点昏了啊！印度绝对是个投机派啊！当然美国把印度给他扶起来，有一点心理安慰啊。有一点心理安慰，但是印度绝对不是说完全听美国摆布的啊！印度这买俄罗斯的这石油比中国买的还多，那这个印度可不是一个这个手拿把掐的一个人啊，随便任美国摆布的一个国家。印度应该不是这样一个国家。
Mexico and the EU.This really took away the leverage we should have because all those countries have the same problems with China that we do. But if you put tariffs on them that are equal to or even exceed,
那这也是胡说啊！有的国家其实对中国还顺差呢啊！美国对中国贸易逆差的一个重要的原因，不就是这个美元太强势了，强美元。你美元太强了，你在美国的话，你这个人工成本太高了呀。人工成本太高了，那就像你美元很强，那大家都去搞金融了，靠金融挣钱，那你制造业显然就不挣钱。就像中国前几年一直搞房地产，你搞房地产，你怎么可能，你制造业就怎么说呢？你那钱肯定都流到房地产，大家都去炒房啊。在美国大家都在炒金融啊，那你钱往哪儿流？往金融那儿流，那你自然就不会流到这个制造业上面啊。加上其他国家的这个人工便宜啊，它制造业自然就 强啊，中国制造业自然就强一些。那我觉得他这也是没有一个，他完全站在一个地缘政治的角度，没有站在经济学的角度，所以经济学他还是在这儿这个相当于有一点情绪化的。
Ceding the tariffs on China, they didn't have the wish to work with us. So it's this very complicated relationship, but I think those are the four areas: human rights, military competition, tech competition, economic competition. And that is going to be, I think, what we're going to have to live with. How do we manage the competition so that it doesn't descend into conflict? And that was the instruction I had from President Biden. Compete with China, but we have to live in peace with China. And we have to find issues like climate change, fentanyl, where we can work together with China. It's a lot more complex than just this very quick tour of the relationship, but it's quite a relationship.
Thank you. So many sub-questions about that. But, we can go back to, China joining the WTO, China shock, et cetera. As you have said, so these problems in the business arena of the competition have existed for a long time. And you, I think, see a good deal of continuity in our assessment of the threat from previous administrations, from the administration that you represented, to, it sounds like, how you look at Trump's response to China, not to the allies.
Well, it's interesting. And if you think about the red-blue divide, the ideological divide in the United States, Republicans and Democrats on most days can't agree that the sky is blue. But if you ask them about China, there's remarkable similarity of views among the Republican Party and Democratic Party leadership. It's not completely identical. Democrats have believed that climate change is real, that the science is more than legitimate. It's an existential threat. We've got to work with China. China's the largest emitter of carbon. We're number 2. So in the last 4 years,
美国是 number 2啊，那你算上历史的啊，这个当然是马凯硕的观点，之前分享过啊。马凯硕在回应一个西方的一个记者还企业家的问题的时候，就说中国搞环境污染是吧？那中国环境污染，中国印度那都环境污染，人家要发展啊。那你算上历史的这个排放的话，那这个环境变化、气候变化肯定不是一朝一夕的啊。这当然马凯硕的观点不是一朝一夕的。那么你是不是要算上历史上的这个气候的变化？那么显然美国、欧盟那远远要超过中国了。
I worked very closely with John Kerry and then John Podesta. They were the 2 climate negotiators, and we really felt that we had to work with China on this. President Trump has disavowed that, which I think is a major mistake. But with that,
disavowed climate cooperation.
Climate. Mm-hmm. Yeah, President Trump has taken us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. He's taken us out of any work with China or the EU or Japan or India, the other large emitters of carbon, and this is going to set the world back. And
这个还是利益的问题啊。川普退出这个气候协定，还不是他肯定有利益，对吧？在这个传统的能源上面，这个石油大国嘛，石油能源啊。
And so, with that exception, it's interesting. I think Joe Biden and Donald Trump, if you had them on the stage tonight, they probably wouldn't say, they have identical policies. But I was out there. We implemented all of the Trump tariffs from 2020 on China because we felt they were right as a way to pressure the Chinese. Joe Biden actually put 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs, electric vehicles, 50% on semiconductors, 25% on lithium batteries. He actually upped the ante, and at least until now, President Trump has maintained the Biden tariffs on China. Why have we done this? Because I think it's pretty clear now, and economists have done the modeling, that between the late 1990s and about 2010, we lost between 1.5 to 2 million American jobs.
这个东西他说是不公平贸易，那你美元霸权也是属于不公平贸易，不公平啊。这从中国的角度来说，对吧？
Because of unfair competition, manufactured exports from China sold below the cost of production. 低于生产成本，那怎么可能啊？
只是低于在美国生产的成本，对吧
？And designed to kill.
换句话来说，市场经济不就应该是这样的吗？但是这个我也搞不明白了。这市场经济不就应该互相的多竞争吗？只是说中国它只是说它的体制不一样，对吧？但是加入 WTO 也是美国让加入 WTO 的。
Kill American companies. And, if you go to Fall River, if you go to New Bedford, if you go to Lowell, if you go to Fitchburg, if you go to Springfield, Claremont, New Hampshire, where Libby and I were just a couple of weeks ago, you see a lot of hollowed out downtowns. And those downtowns were once thriving. And it's very interesting over the last year. It's not just Donald Trump and Joe Biden who have raised this issue. Who's put tariffs on China in the last 12 months? Fascinating. India, Turkey, South Africa, a very close friend of China, Brazil, another close friend of China, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Canada, the European Union, and the United States of America. The Chinese are manufacturing 2 to 3 times domestic demand, what they can sell in their own country, and they're exporting it below the cost of production in robotics, in steel, in EVs, in semiconductors, lots of categories, and they're out to kill the producers in those countries and achieve market share. And, the first responsibility of government is protect our economy, protect our countries. So I actually see a united front from the 2 political parties in our country. And I'm talking to senators and members of the House. It's pretty clear we have a strategy that is agreed to. So I really hope President Trump can succeed here.
Okay. But at the same time, we can't deal ourselves out by making trade with our actual allies.
Exactly.
So punitive. I mean, I'm not saying that, but it sounds like that's the reasoning.
I think President Trump has reduced his potential effectiveness to leverage Xi Jinping, because he should have Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission, and the Japanese prime minister and the Korean president with them. But if you're exacting high tariffs on them, look what happened in the state of Georgia, too. The ICE incident at the South Korean plant there, there's a lot of unhappiness in allied capitals that we're not treating them well, which is why I felt I had to raise the issue of 9/11, how much we owe our allies.
9/11 就911事件的时候，这地方应该是翻译有问题，就是911事件的时候，这些盟友对美国很好，支援美国了。然后前段时间那个韩国的一个事件，应该是让韩国人很不满了，也是闹得很，把韩国人直接给他遣返了。
And yes, okay. So wow, there's so much more to talk about. So I would love to go into more detail, but in a competition, I didn't think you were going to say rivalry, but okay, a rivalry. Someone is winning and losing. Certain aspects or arenas of the competition are more important. You look behind to see how the guy back there is doing, or how much you have to go to catch up. Essentially, how are we doing? Who's ahead? And how do you know when you get there?
Xi Jinping began to say publicly as early as 2020.
这个地方应该开始讲这个，中美谁更先进了啊
The East is rising.
东升西降
And the West is falling.
And
in all of my time in China, I met, of course, the entire leadership, spent a lot of time with Xi Jinping and his cabinet. We went to, Libby and I, 26 provinces, met governors, met Communist Party secretaries, professors, business people. I think in general, I have 2 observations. One is, many in the Chinese elite believe that the United States is a fading power.
这个吗？对，有可能。但是中国怎么说呢？它有一种观点，它主要是流行一种观点，是吧？主要是一种观点占主导，没有像美国这种，你能看到很多的跟政府的看法是吧不一样的，是吧？大家观点很多。
They point to our dysfunctional political system and political reality in Washington. They point to our sagging infrastructure.
这个倒是事实啊。Infrastructure 应该是 美国稍微现在，对吧？没有进步那么快。
Although President Biden and the Congress, both parties were able to pass a $1 trillion bill.
这个$1 trillion bill 这个东西确实在美国你出去看也是工地是非常多的，在地上的这个很多地方都在修。
And let's hope we can rebuild the infrastructure of our country. I spent all my time trying to disavow them, disavow that sentiment, and convince them we're not dying. And
这个有意思啊。
One of the ways that I tried to do that was on social media and public diplomacy, but on Weibo and WeChat.
人家也有微博啊。
There are hundreds of millions of Chinese on those social media platforms to wage what we call the battle of ideas. You think we're a country of the past? We believe in human freedom, we believe in human rights, and we went after the Chinese on Tibet, on Xinjiang, the mistreatment of the Uyghur population. I was just in Hong Kong this past weekend on what's happened to Hong Kong and the national security law that's extinguished the political rights of the people of Hong Kong. And so we went on the offensive because they were after us to say, actually, we're not a country of the past. We have a big future. We have self-confidence in our system of government. And so it was a very combative relationship. And they used the power of the press to attack me and attack President Biden, but that's part of this push and pull in this relationship.
Push and pull in this relationship.
Thank you. So you're actually anticipating something that I wanted to ask about. How public diplomacy, or does public diplomacy actually matter? Of course, at World Boston, in our way, we engage in it. We, of course, are a big host of the International Visitors Leadership Program, so we think it's important. But is it really? Are the Chinese taking, for example, the challenge of public diplomacy seriously?
Very
or is this
seriously.
Just for fun? You know, we like the exchanges.
So unfortunately, if you think about the natural advantage that a democratic society like the United States, think of Hollywood, think of our IT system we should have, we're way behind the Chinese. They have CCTV and CGTN. If you go to any hotel room in the world, you're going to get a Chinese government broadcasting station spewing out a lot of misinformation about us and a lot of
有这么牛吗？CCTV 和 CGTN 全世界每一个酒店都有，这有点夸张吧？
misinformation about their model democracy. They call themselves a whole process democracy. What have
全过程民主都知道。
we done? Well, Elon Musk and the Doge team destroyed the Voice of America, dismantled it, fired everybody. That was created back in the Truman administration to combat the war of the battle of ideas we had with the Soviet Union. We figured there were about 300 million Chinese listening behind their firewall.
翻墙来 YouTube 的都得翻墙啊。
You know, they can't get Google. There's no free internet. They live in a closed environment, 1.4 billion people.
但是翻墙出来的那绝大部分还是这个爱国的，爱国爱党啊，对吧？也更大一部分应该是对于中华文明啊，中国这个文化是认同的，是吧？毕竟民主这个东西啊，在中国怎么说呢？当然，这个也是中国的一个目标之一啦，是吧？是八荣八耻，其中有一个也是民主啊，是吧？民主在中国也不是说是一个坏事啊，党内也讲究民主嘛。
But Voice of America got in. And Radio Free Asia got in, and both have been dismantled by the Trump administration. This doesn't make any sense. It leaves us defenseless. It leaves the entire platform to China. I'll give you one example. The Indonesian government has a good relationship with both China and the U.S. So their state broadcaster, until about 2 months ago, gave an hour of time every week to Voice of America and an hour of time to CCTV, the Chinese state broadcaster. Well, we destroyed and dismantled Voice of America.
这个有意思，这个是新的知识啊。印度尼西亚给了中国1小时，给了美国1小时。现在美国不，但是好像 VOA 还存在吧
？This past spring and summer, so that second hour, our hour, was given to the Chinese broadcaster. So in terms of our outreach to the rest of the world to explain in 194 other nation states who we are, what we believe in, to give our side of the story, we've just emasculated ourselves. We have no more state capability in the U.S. government, which we have had now for nearly 80 years, because President Trump and Elon Musk decided that it wasn't worthy. I'll give you another example. The Belt Road Initiative, I think you've all heard of that. The Chinese have put out about $1 trillion US to the rest of the world in loans and grants, particularly in the global south, since 2012. We had an organization called the U.S. Agency for International Development. It wasn't perfect, but it was doing a lot of good work. President George W. Bush, through PEPFAR, we were supplying vaccines and HIV treatment and saving not just millions of lives, tens of millions of lives through American assistance. USAID was dismantled in 8 days in February of this year. They actually took a blowtorch to the moniker of USAID above the building on Constitution Avenue. 8,000 people were fired summarily, friends of ours, colleagues of ours, in 1 week. I mean, you didn't go through the organization the way a normal manager would say, okay, where's the fat? Who's performing? Who's underperforming? Every government agency needs a lot of reform, constant reform. But to destroy it in 1 week and fire 8,500 people, it was just officially dismantled a couple of weeks ago. It has ceased to exist. And so China is out with its couple of fire reforming through the constant reform. It was just China is out with its tremendous world-breaking, in terms of $1 trillion US dollars program, and we have nothing going for ourselves. So here's the story to illustrate it. I flew into Lima, Peru last November 15th. After our election, President Trump had won, and President Biden was going to have his last summit meeting with President Xi Jinping. And when I landed, I read a New York Times article, front page that day, which had a graphic, and it showed South America. And the New York Times said, in 2002, the United States was the leading trade partner of every country in South America. In 2024, China was the leading trade partner of every country except for Colombia in South America. And then I turned on my TV in Lima, and there was President Xi Jinping, who'd arrived a day before us, and he was dedicating a $3 billion port for the people of Peru that the Chinese people paid for. You have to admire their ambition, their strategic focus. They are out there trying to claim what you call in business market share, but allegiance. They want other countries to follow their model and follow them and choose them, not us. And we have now taken ourselves off the field with the destruction of USAID and Voice of America. Does that make sense for the American people? I asked the question.
All right. We're going to end on this portion on a question. I have so much more I would love to go into, but I'm sure you all have questions too. So let's leave it there for the moment and see if we have any questions from the audience.
Thank you very much for your excellent speech, Ambassador Burns. And I want to ask a question. It's about as an American ambassador in China, how do you consider the Chinese issue, they're aiming their target about international order? So we have seen that there's a lot of statement about that. Like in 2010, was Prime Secretary Hu Jintao was saying that the most greatest dream of Chinese people is to unite it, and then it's like they only want the sovereignty of Taiwan, and then they can stop. But in 2012, you mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, and later they have another system like the Community of Shared Future of Mankind and other.
So we're going to try and boil that down to the essence of your question, if that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we met coming in, didn't we? You're from Northeastern, and you were from Guangzhou, Canton. Yeah, Libby and I met Xi when we came into the library tonight. So thank you for the question. Thank you for being a student here. One of the things we haven't talked about is we have about 273,000 Chinese students in the United States. We in the Biden administration felt they are very welcome. We want Chinese students in our country. They contribute a lot to our universities. I've taught many Chinese students. I was very pleased when President Trump said 2 weeks ago there were calls from some Republicans to kick out all the Chinese students. And President Trump said, I'd like to have 600,000 Chinese students. And so I agree with President Trump in that basis. On your question, Taiwan is probably the most serious issue in the relationship. It's certainly the most dangerous issue between us. The American position has been remarkably consistent and clear since President Nixon's trip to China in 1972. We believe there's one China, but we believe the dispute across the Strait of Taiwan Strait between Taiwan and the People's Republic has to be adjudicated, worked out peacefully. And so we have certainly not agreed, we've vociferously disagreed with the bellicose language from the government of China towards Taiwan. And we think the Chinese government should commit to a peaceful resolution of this dispute. We don't support the independence of Taiwan. No American president in 50 years has done that. But we do believe that that society has a right to be free, has a right to be democratic, has a right to practice the system they want to have. And so this is a much more, it's a much more complicated issue than that. But that is, in a nutshell, the policy of every American president from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump. And this does give me the opportunity also to say we've addressed really the competitive part of this relationship. We were dedicated in the Biden administration to trying to find issues to work with China when our interests aligned. Talked about climate change. Fentanyl is a leading cause of death in our society of Americans 18 to 49. The majority of the precursor chemicals that make up the synthetic opioid come from the Chinese black market, not from the government of China, but from the black market. And President Biden and Senator Chuck Schumer and a bipartisan delegation of senators, when we went in to see President Xi in 2023, he agreed to help the United States. And he was true to his word. China began to work against the black market. We didn't think the government of China did enough, but it was a good start. And now President Trump is insisting that China go further, and I think he's right to do that. And so there's another issue where we can work with the Chinese government, fentanyl. Last issue would be we've had 4 pandemics since 2002, beginning with the SARS pandemic. And of course, we all lived through the coronavirus pandemic. Law of averages, we'll face another pandemic. I would hope that this time, as opposed to March 2020, our two countries with big public health capacity, we should work together and put aside our political differences. That was our sentiment in the Biden administration. And I do want to accentuate, we believe that war between China and the United States would be an absolute catastrophe. and we made every effort to drive down the probability of a war. And President Biden believed that we had to live together. I certainly passionately agreed to that. So this is a hard relationship to manage when your strongest competitor is also a country with which you have to live in peace. And that's the test of our diplomacy. Can we manage the competition, which is happening and will happen, in such a way that we don't drive it towards conflict? And I felt strongly that we succeeded in doing that in the Biden administration. And let's hope that President Trump can achieve the same result. So thank you. Thank you for being here in Boston.
So I'm going to break in with a question because it's so relevant to where you just were. Looking for indicators, landmarks, et cetera. There is a meeting between Xi and Trump coming up, probably.
I hope.
Probably.
Yeah.
So there's that to look for. What will you be looking for to accomplish or understand from that? And then in the in the near term, let's pick the 2026 elections as a near term. What are the key moments in the relationship that you're going to be looking for?
Well, I think first, I hope that President Trump and President Xi will be able to meet because the Chinese system is now really a party of one. Xi Jinping is the unrivaled power. Deng Xiaoping's theory after Mao was that Mao's excesses during the Cultural Revolution nearly ruined China. So Deng said, we've got to have a committee of equals in the Standing Committee of the Politburo, and that's what he practiced. President Xi Jinping, since 2012, has made it into an administration of one. So you really can't get anything done in terms of our big relationship with China on these major issues unless you're meeting with President Xi. And so President Trump had a pretty good relationship with him in his first term, and they want a meeting. And there's speculation, I don't know if it's going to happen, that there's an APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Conference meeting in Seoul, Korea at the end of October. Could they meet on the margins of that meeting? We'll see. But here's the kicker. The Chinese tradition is, when you have summit meetings, that everything is worked out before the two leaders walk in. So will Scott Bessent, our Treasury Secretary, and Vice Premier Hurley Feng be able to work out a new trade deal that would lower the tariffs between us and also look at some of the other problems in the economic relationship? If they can work that out, I think there probably will be a trade meeting. And since we're the number 1 and 2 economies in the world, we've got to hope that we can climb down from these stratospherically high tariff levels and try to work something out. Think about what's happened on tariffs since January. We began this calendar year with, I think, an effective tariff rate of 2.5%. We now have an effective tariff rate because of the President's Trump tariff policies of 18.6%. These are the highest tariff levels since Smoot-Hawley in 1931. And the great majority of economists in the United States would say that was a critical strategic mistake for President Herbert Hoover to put such high tariffs on our economy, and one of the principal reasons we ended up in a Great Depression. Now, let's hope that doesn't happen with our country. But I think, unfortunately, the Trump tariffs have completely made this a Wild West globally. The world of order that Truman and Eisenhower and JFK and Reagan created on tariffs, on the United Nations system, on...
When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it wasn't just the Ukrainians and the Europeans who were watching the U.S. response. It was China as well, presumably. And so, when the Chinese look at Zelensky in the Oval Office being drubbed by President Trump, and Marco Rubio was silent through all that. And when you see our allies being treated the way they are, how does that impact the Chinese perception of U.S. support for Taiwan?
Really good question. Thank you for making the link between China and what lessons it's drawing from the Ukraine conflict for Taiwan, because that's a big subject. I think that, first of all, the Chinese have told me in the spring of 22, we're completely neutral in this war, and I never believed it, and it's not true. The Chinese have been providing the major military support, microelectronics for the Russian defense industrial base to Moscow. And we've sanctioned the Biden and Trump administrations, I think, over 300 Chinese companies that are doing this. So that's point number one. Point number two, the Chinese are looking intently at Ukraine for two reasons. First, if Putin gets away with this crime, if we don't stand up to him, if the United States does not support Zelensky and support the Europeans who want to arm Zelensky, then I think Xi Jinping, I know the Chinese leadership, are going to look at that and say, well, if they weren't willing to support Ukraine in the heart of Europe, why would they support Taiwan? So they would draw the exact opposite lesson that we want them to draw. Second, the Taiwan Authority, the Taiwan government, has been very, very quick to understand what the Ukrainians have done well. A much smaller army has held off this gigantic Russian army and done just brilliantly with great cost to their society, with all the people dead. But they've held off the Red Army, the Russian army. And so the Taiwanese are now undertaking a major campaign to become a drone power and to try to fashion a strategy that would negate the advantage of a cross-strait invasion by the PLA Navy and Air Force. So I think the Chinese are learning two lessons, one that really worries them, and that's the latter one. By the way, if you just think about the nature of warfare, we are witnessing a revolution in warfare. Drone technology is dominating the battle space. The Russians brutally launched the biggest attack of the war Sunday night, a drone attack on Kyiv and 10 other cities, and they're just trying to kill civilians to intimidate the Ukrainian population. It's absolutely brutal.
Into NATO airspace with their drones.
They did.
As it is reported. I don't know that.
That was not a mistake. And so it was very important. The first ever violation of NATO airspace since 1949 occurred 2 days ago, when the Russians flew drones, not just one or two off course, into the middle of Poland to intimidate the Poles and NATO. Every single NATO leader, from Mark Carney in Ottawa to all the European leaders, denounced it. We have not seen President Trump over the last couple of days to denounce it. He needs to get tougher on Putin. You know, President Trump has reached out to Putin. He's given him chance after chance over the last 8 months, particularly at Anchorage several weeks ago, and Putin has given nothing in return. He doesn't agree to a ceasefire, which everybody else wants. He thinks he can make further progress on the battlefield against Ukraine, and we've got to join with the Europeans and give them stronger support. We stopped providing arms to Ukraine. I think that was a major mistake, because if Putin wins this, what it will do, it'll divide Europe. An authoritarian East, a democratic West. Who remembers the old Cold War here? A lot of us of a certain age remember it. I was working for, Condi Rice and I were the two-person Soviet team for President H.W. Bush in the White House when the Cold War ended. And I'll never forget December 25th, 1991, Libby won't either. President Bush addressed the nation that night, and he said, we and the Poles and Pope John Paul II, the people of Eastern Europe, are victorious. In the Cold War, over 5 decades, the people of Europe liberated themselves. And it did not end in war. It ended in peace. And he said these words, Europe is now whole, free, and at peace. Putin is trying to make Europe divided, unfree, and in a state of constant war. And why should it matter to Bostonians and Americans? Europe's our largest trade partner, the largest investor in our economy and in our New England economy, and the largest number of American allies are in NATO. It really matters. And so this is for all the marbles. And, you know, I understand why President Trump wanted to give Putin a chance, February, March, April, May, June, July, August. Putin has snubbed him. It's time for our president to speak up about what happened in Poland, join the Europeans, lead NATO. We don't want to go to war with Russia. We want to deter Russia. Sanctions.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ambassador Burns. Thank you, World Boston. My name is Lamin Savadogo. I want to push a little bit back on the question that you were asked about who is ahead. You know China more than most people. Some of your academic colleagues think that China has peaked. Some of them think that they are not impressed by the show in a couple of days ago.
Okay.
Could you talk to us about the underbelly? We talk about the Evergrande. We talk about the unsustainable debt at the provincial level, the infrastructure that looks very impressive, but that those trains are not really running well. That tofu drag, I'm sure you heard the expression.
Great.
Could you talk to us about the underbelly a little bit? Thank you.
What an
underbelly.
interesting question. It really, I mean, all the questions have been interesting. We could probably organize a course at Northeastern or Harvard or Boston College or BU on every question. If Libby were here, she's in the audience. I don't want to force her to come here and speak. There she is. Libby and I have been talking a lot over the last couple of months since we came home to Cambridge, Mass, to say, what did we learn? What did we process? And certainly Libby thinks, and I agree with her, we've underestimated Chinese power in the world. Those trains are fabulous. We rode those trains. You can go from Beijing to Shanghai in 4.5 hours. And that's, 1,000 kilometers. We have Amtrak's just not like that. If you've read a sellout from Boston to New York. But the level of infrastructure, here's the strengths. The infrastructure, that's one strength. Second, their scientific and technological capacity. That's the coin of the realm in our decade, in the next few decades. Which society will turn out more scientists and engineers? Here's a data point. 34% of first-year students in Chinese universities study engineering or a STEM field. The United States of America, 5.6%. And they're a much bigger country. Harvard graduation, where I teach, when we ask our graduate students to stand up as a class, chemistry majors, biology majors, physics majors, largely Asian Americans. Some American citizens, Asians, American citizens of Asian ethnicity, or Chinese, Japanese, Taiwanese. Last week, when President Trump gathered all the tech titans of the United States in the White House, tremendous number of those tech titans are Indian Americans and Chinese Americans or Taiwanese Americans. We're not competing when it really matters for the future, and that's on technology. So, and I think the PLA, some people have said, well, it hasn't fought since 1978. What it's worth, I've seen the PLA. I think we've underestimated their military strength, their technology strength, and one other thing. The Communist Party of China is strategic, and they don't have to worry about, we want to worry about what the press says. I mean, that's a good thing to have the press challenging the government. They have nobody opposing them. And so they can make big bets over 10, 20, 30 years. Mary and I were mentioning one of them. For 35 consecutive years, the Chinese foreign minister, whoever that person is, has made his first trip of the year in January to Africa to show the Africans, you are our priority. I think President Trump never went to Africa in his first term. President Biden went once to Angola for 2 or 3 days in December, just before he resigned. They're strategic, and we're not competing on that level. So I think the Chinese and technology, military, economics are stronger than we think they are. And I think we've underestimated them, and we can't do that any longer. So that's my answer to your question. It's a complicated subject, but thank you for it.
Tim down here. Hi, Tim.
So we believe as sort of a network that every person in this room, every person in this country is a citizen diplomat. As the government steps back from diplomatic engagement, what can we all do to fill in that space?
So, a lot of this conversation is about what divides us and how tough-minded we need to be. But we also need to be dedicated to a peaceful relationship, and I think part of that is a function of, can we keep the two societies meeting? And COVID really interrupted things. Data point, there were 5 million tourists that went back and forth between our two countries in 2019. And I think that number went down to something like 190,000 by 2022 because the Chinese government shut down China. We all quarantined. We quarantined 21 days on arrival, Libby and I. So we need to get tourism back. Students, we have a healthy number, unfortunately, of Chinese students in America. We had 15,000 American students 10 years ago in China. We went down to 350 by 2022. So I made it a major priority to work with Duke University, Stanford, Georgetown, Yale, UCLA, Berkeley, to try to get them to come back with their Mandarin language programs, come back with their junior year students, come back with their summer programs, because I had this huge advantage as ambassador. My embassy was filled with Americans, diplomats, and military officers who were fluent in Mandarin because they had it in grade school or college, and they had experience, 2 or 3 times experience of living in China. And if we keep going at the rate we are, we only have 1,104 students now, American students, in all of China. Then my successor 10 or 15 or 20 years ago is not going to have the bench I had. And, you know, China is the other great society. So whether you're in business or academics or education or healthcare or government, we need Americans who speak the language, Mandarin, who've been there, who understand the other culture if we're going to have a peaceful relationship. So funny story. My staff didn't know exactly how many students, American students we had a year ago today. So at a staff meeting, I said, call every Chinese university and ask them, how many Americans do you have? And the number came back about 6 weeks later, 1,104. In December, I went to Guizhou province, which is one of the poorest provinces, very beautiful place. In China, I went to Guizhou University. I met with the president, 40,000 students there. I said, Mr. President, I understand you don't have any American students. He said, we do. We've got 1 student. And he's right behind this curtain. And he called out this young man, 19-year-old, and I can use his name because he told me I could use his name, Jared Shelley from Berkeley, California. And I said, Jared, you're number 1,105. He had no idea what I was talking about. I said, we've upped the number by 1. I said, how did you get here? It was fascinating. He said 2 reasons. He said, my mom and dad are PhDs in Chinese studies from Berkeley. So in our household, you know, we talked about China, and my mom and dad were inspirations. He said, but the real reason was I had a girlfriend in his Sacramento, California high school from the Miao community. That's a minority community in China, and she was an immigrant to the United States. And he said, my Miao community girlfriend convinced me that Guizhou University was the center of the world and that I should go to college there. And I said, so are you still with her? He said, no, we broke up. But it was interesting because as Jared was talking to me, he kept breaking into Mandarin. I said, Jared, are there any other Americans here? He said, none, 40,000 students. He said, I'm living with 6 other Chinese guys. It's perfect. He said, I'd never speak English. And he was becoming fluent in Mandarin. We need more Jareds. Because that's the way to keep the peace between societies. Integration, cultural integration, the work that World Boston does in receiving Chinese visitors to this country. I walked through Harvard Yard today, huge groups of Chinese tourists around the John Harvard statue. I thought, good. Because, you know, we can be hard line on the military, on human rights. The Chinese people are not our enemy. And we have to live in peace with them, and what better way than to understand them? So I think it's great that we have Mr. Xi here from Northeastern, from China, from Guangzhou, here at Northeastern. Can I just say that? Welcome.
David Leonard, Boston Public Library. So I get the last question. Welcome, Ambassador. I want to pull back out to the state of expertise in the federal agencies as a result of this radical change in policies. Because one of the ways to diagnose a problem is to ask yourself, how easy would it be to correct or put it back later? And so I'd love to get your take on the state of our diplomacy, state, and international relations capacity.
Thank you. And first of all, thank you for maintaining this jewel, the Boston Public Library, for our city. Look, I spent a long time in government, in both Republican and Democratic administrations. I would never say that government's perfect. And because we don't operate in the profit motive, and we don't have to even show a profit or a revenue stream, there's a lot of fat in government agencies. Not in every government agency, but in many, and I've seen it. And so I've really respected the Secretaries of State. I've mentioned Condi Rice, Colin Powell, who launched a major reform effort. And sometimes you need fewer people. Sometimes you need to cut the budget. That's totally understandable. But the way we did it in January, February, and March was to bring a bunch of people in who didn't know government. And they were acting, they just fired people en masse without interviewing them, without giving them a chance. These are 30 and 40-year veterans of our government. So what value do you bring to this agency? None of those questions were asked. They had quotas. Secretary Rubio just fired 3,000, American diplomats. We're a very small service. We're about 15,000 people. That's small for government. There's 2.5 million people in the military. There are about 15,000 American diplomats. We just fired 3,000 of them. And they fired people. They said, we don't want to fire anybody overseas. And so we rotate back and forth from overseas to the State Department. They just picked 3,000 people in Washington, some of whom were just about to go overseas, and said, because you're here and we have a quota, you're all gone. And it wasn't done respectfully. Our tradition, when we let people go, and I've had to do this as ambassador and as undersecretary of state, is we respect them. We say, you've got a 2-month or 3-month window. We're going to give you a goodbye party. They actually went into the State Department offices and said, you're out in 3 hours. Take a box. We're going to watch you as you unpack. I mean, it's just the kind of stuff you see on TV. It was done very disrespectfully. So I think when the pendulum swings to another Republican president or a Democratic president, really, I think if a president comes in who really cares about the federal bureaucracy and understands that they have value, we're going to have to recreate these institutions, probably not exact replicas of Voice of America or USAID, but we're going to have to recreate these institutions because China is out-competing us by a long mile. We're not telling our story. We're no longer vaccinating kids who can't afford to be vaccinated in global South poor countries. It's a shame. It's not where the American people are. We want to be generous. So that would be my answer. Can I say one more thing? So Libby, we've been married 44 years. And we're from here. Thank you. We're from here. And Libby made the huge mistake several years ago of coming to one of my evening lectures at the Kennedy School. And it was all about this conversation, one of the big problems that we're facing. And so we were walking home in Cambridge, and I said innocently, I thought, how'd that go? And she said, there was a pause, and she said, you're depressing everybody. And I said, what do you mean I'm depressing everybody? And this was really an important, I'm serious, and she knows I'm serious, lesson for me as a professor and as a professional. She said, I get that there are 1,000 problems out there, but what are you hopeful about? Because you can't leave those young students at Harvard or any place else thinking there's no hope. And so that was my big lesson. And so with Libby's admonition in line, and she's sitting right in front of me, I want to leave you with a little bit of hope. I'm hopeful that the American private sector, our tech companies, our university researchers, and we should fully fund our universities, especially Harvard. I just want to get that in there. The biggest challenge we face is not to be number 2 in AI. It's all up to the tech companies and MIT and Caltech and Carnegie Mellon, Harvard Engineering, etc., UT Austin, UCLA. And I think they're going to succeed because the spirit of innovation, of academic inquiry versus a authoritarian model of education and technology, I think we're going to win that. Secondly, if we can just remember 9/11 and how the Canadians and the Europeans and the Japanese and the Koreans came to our rescue, if we can be alliance-oriented and see them as multipliers of our values, then I think we can contain Putin and we can contain Xi Jinping in the future and keep the peace. I'm hopeful about those two trend lines. And so there's so much riding on our presidents and secretaries of state getting this right and our citizens being educated. And that's what World Boston does. And I'm hopeful about World Boston as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicholas Burns.